Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. And the first thing I've been thinking about is the tensions between the United States and Israel. Tensions between Washington and Jerusalem are reaching a historic high. The President of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world, publicly chastised the Prime Minister of Israel. Publicly chastised. But, and here's the good news, the situation is not as dire as it appears. Israel and the United States have always had a big brother, younger brother relationship. And like all siblings, they fight, they quibble, they say awful things to each other, but they will always be there for each other. In fact, the reason they feel comfortable saying those awful things is because they know that they will always be there for each other. Tensions, and these tensions specifically, as high and dramatic as they are, will pass. The most visible, the most public way for Biden to diss Bibi is by holding back on that traditional invite to the White House. For decades, every incoming Israeli prime minister would visit the White House. The tradition grew to resemble a rite of passage. Soon after assuming the mantle of leadership in Jerusalem, the Prime Minister makes the pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. to meet with the sitting U.S. President. Now, the trip had many purposes. On the personal level, for some it was a first meeting, a get to know you, a chat. Israel and the United States are so close, such close allies, and work so closely together on so many issues, it was important for the leaders to really get to know one another. On the public side, the President and the Prime Minister would reiterate a commitment of mutual support. That's important here, because on the security side, they would agree that Israel's nuclear technology and weapons were properly secured and would be utilized responsibly. And most importantly, they would agree that the United States has Israel's back, and the United States would actively engage and defend Israel in any multi-front war against her attackers. For certain, there are other items that would be discussed by various presidents and prime ministers depending on the time, and issues based on their personalities. We can only speculate about those. Historically, the meetings were always conducted behind closed doors, because many of them were secret discussions. Afterwards, there would always be a press conference. And that was the opportunity for these world leaders to charm the media. The smiles and the handshakes, the pats on the back appeared genuine and usually were, not always, you should know. But the audience they were playing for was not the local audiences. It was essential for the security of Israel and security for the region and for the best interest of the United States, for the world to see the relationship between Israel and the United States. The warm relationship, the cordial relationship, the we are on the same page relationship between these two nations. And it continues even though the leadership has changed. By breaking with tradition, the White House, this White House, is trying to teach Jerusalem a lesson. They are minimizing the brush off by using historical arguments. They claim that Biden has known Bibi for 40 years, and they already have a strong and very friendly relationship. But the world needs to see it in action. And right now, what the world sees and hears is Biden saying that he's frustrated. It is obvious that Washington is not pleased with the new government in Israel, especially Bibi's push for judicial reform. And despite the decades of warm friendship between the two leaders, Bibi does not care that Biden is displeased. Bibi Netanyahu has almost certainly determined that he can weather the storm. He has calculated that Joe Biden cannot and will not be reelected. No matter which victor emerges in 2024 in the U.S. presidential election, Republican or Democrat, it will not be Joe Biden. That realization gives Netanyahu peace of mind. He will be friendly to the sitting U.S. president, but Bibi is behaving as if Biden is a lame duck. The non-invite to Washington, aka the invite which will come whenever it comes, does not trouble Jerusalem. If it did, Jerusalem would be lobbying hard for that meeting, and they are not lobbying at all. That tells us a lot. This White House does not understand. It certainly does not understand that Israel today is a divided country. It is split nearly perfectly in half. The division is not just about judicial reform. It is about almost everything, and it's certainly split, especially split, about Netanyahu. And this is where Israel has the upper hand. The United States is also split in half, right down the middle, not just about Trump and his indictment. You see, you can find this in the television ratings, where Fox versus the others. It's not just about Trump and his indictment. Congress is split. The House of Republicans and the Senate. The United States is wrenched right down the middle. Israel understands the United States. The Prime Minister's office is feeling secure. They see these divisions in the United States as they are. Most importantly, they know that the real friendship between Israel and the United States rests in Congress and not in the White House. They know that regardless of what happens on judicial reform, the friendship and the family ties between the United States and Israel will remain intact. Despite the division in Israel, and despite the divisions in the United States, the one issue unifying Washington is the bipartisan, almost unanimous support for Israel. And that's all that matters. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from Ynet, and it's co-authored by Roz Zimmett and Danny Chininovich. It was published on March 29, 2023. The piece is entitled, "Iran Keeps a Close Eye on Netanyahu-Biden Rift and Dismisses Israeli Attack Threats as Baseless." Subtitled, "Tehran, which continues to move closer to nuclear arms, watches Israel-US tensions with glee. At one of the gravest and most significant crossroads it has ever faced, Israel's government is busy with judicial overhaul." This column is very important. It may seem obvious. Yes, Iran is watching Israel-US tensions. Of course they are. As I said, the whole world is watching. But let's see what these authors have to say about it. This is how the authors begin. U.S. President Joe Biden's criticism of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his public statement that the Israeli premier will not be invited to the White House anytime soon were released shortly after the dramatic statement by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, regarding the Iranian nuclear program. During his testimony to the United States Senate, which has not received sufficient attention in Israel, Milley stated that Iran could produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in less than 2 weeks and would take a few more months to manufacture a nuclear weapon. His statements are further evidence of the failure of Israeli strategy against Tehran's nuclear program. For years, Israel attempted to prevent Iran from reaching the military nuclear threshold, but instead has brought it significantly closer. The authors continue their analysis, writing that public tensions between Israel and the United States are played out in the international media, and that does not help the situation. Actually, it makes it much worse. They write, "The increasing tension between Israel and the United States is evident in President Biden's remarks, endangers the ability to advance joint moves with Washington to deter Iran from making a strategic decision to cross the nuclear threshold. The domestic political realities in Israel and the developments in its relations with the United States do not escape the attention of Iranian authorities. The media in the country has portrayed, in recent weeks, the domestic crisis in Israel as a reflection of its growing weakness and deepening divisions in society. In addition to the obvious security aspects, this reflects a growing assessment that Israel is constantly weakening, its capabilities are limited, and its threats of attack are unfounded." The authors contend that Israel's insistence on continuing with judicial overhaul will force the United States to push back against them, and that will create even more tension between the United States and Israel. And Iran is looking forward to that. The authors conclude this way, "Especially now, Israel requires a responsible government that is capable of formulating an updated strategy, and leading the necessary measures vis-a-vis the United States. However, in Jerusalem, there is a government obsessed with promoting a judicial overhaul and led by extremist, religious, and messianic elements, including ministers who declare that Israel can manage without Washington's support. This conduct poses a serious threat to Israel's national security at one of the gravest and most significant crossroads it has ever faced. This is an excellent piece. Thank you both. It's really worth thinking about. Next up is a column from Reuters. It's unauthored, as many columns are in Reuters. The subject of the column is the new head of the Human Rights Watch slams Israel on human rights. The title of the piece is Israel is on rampage against human rights, new HRW chief says. It's subtitled, Tirana Hassan urges U.S. to persuade Netanyahu to change course on judicial overhaul. Human Rights Watch labeled Israel an apartheid state in its 2021 reporting, prompting Israeli officials, Jewish groups, and others to slam the group as biased. Reuters begins. Israel's government is on a rampage against human rights, the new head of Human Rights Watch said on Thursday, and urged the United States and other allies to do more to hold it accountable for alleged abuses and persuade it to change course. A planned overhaul of the judiciary by Israel's religious nationalist government would be a disaster for human rights, HRW Executive Director Tirana Hassan told Reuters. Reuters goes on to explain that Human Rights Watch and their perspective. Reuters writes, Hassan, a lawyer who has represented asylum seekers, said she hoped U.S. President Joe Biden's administration would leverage their relationship and their power to ensure that Israel sort of steps back from the brink, which is where they are now when it comes to human rights. We expect the U.S. to be holding Israel to account for the abuses with the same rigor that they are prepared to hold China to account for their abuses, she said. In conclusion, Reuters writes that according to UN High Commission for Human Rights, Israel has violated over 150 cases of human rights. They put it this way. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported a record 152 killings of Palestinians by Israeli security forces last year in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and said Jewish settler violence against Palestinians had also intensified. The increased Israeli operations followed an upsurge in attacks by Palestinians over the past year, in which at least 45 people have been killed, according to Israeli Foreign Ministry figures. In separate comments at a meeting at the United Nations in Geneva on Thursday, Francesca Albanese, a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the territories, said the situation there was deteriorating. I've seen increasing forms of humiliation and indignities that are imposed on the Palestinians, a strengthening of the suffocating architecture, she said. It's important for us to know how the world looks and evaluates and judges Israel. This piece does just that. That's why it was so important for us to read it today. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 5 cartoons and memes today, and there are a slew of jokes about fathers and fathers' jokes. If you haven't heard them, some of them are hilarious. They are called dad jokes. Not bad jokes, dad jokes. They're jokes that normally evoke a sound like, ugh, and look of exasperation from our children. We used to call them corny jokes. They're actually funny. This meme reads, dad jokes help kids develop into healthy adults. Study. It's hard to believe, but the study showed that those corny jokes and the teasing of their fathers helped children appreciate their parents. Next is a cartoon that depicts Congress interrogating the head of TikTok, a Chinese company that transfers the private details of its users to the Chinese Communist Party. TikTok argued that all companies do it. Congress yells at them, "Shame on you. Only American companies should be allowed to spy and steal users' data." That's hilarious. Unfortunate, but true. Along the same theme, a couple is sitting on the couch, and she says, I just got a Facebook alert through my Instagram contacts via my Gmail list that TikTok may be tracking me. Well, that's not a joke. It happens to be true. In this next cartoon, Israel is depicted as a scale of justice. Protesters are pounding at Prime Minister Netanyahu, and in his hand, he's holding a scale of justice also, and he's cutting the scales with a scissor because of judicial review. Next up is a cartoon of Ukrainian President Zelensky, and his arms are crossed. Pointed at him is a tank turret embossed with the Olympic seal. Putin and the head of the Olympic Committee are sitting on the seal. The cartoon is based on Zelensky's announcement that in the next Olympics, Ukrainians will not compete head-to-head with Russians. He said it would hurt Ukraine and would hurt the Ukrainian people. So there's going to be a lot of tension on that in the next few months. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The Israeli Air Force recently shot down an unidentified aircraft that had crossed the border from Syria. In reporting the incident, the IDF stressed that there was no danger to civilians at any time. This incident occurred less than 24 hours after military targets were hit in central Syria in an attack attributed to Israel. Fighter jets and choppers were dispatched to intercept the intruding aircraft into Israel, while it was monitored by the Air Force the entire time. It was then shot down in an unpopulated area, and no sirens were even set off. The military was on the scene to collect the remnants of the aircraft. It was almost certainly an unmanned aerial drone from Iran. It's also important to collect the remnants and debris from enemy military equipment. Every scrap provides valuable information. Israel is always wary of opening up border crossings when tensions are high, especially around holiday times, like now. These last few days have been a confluence of both Passover and Ramadan and Easter. But the decision to open borders was made nevertheless. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides welcomed the new opening hours of the Allenby crossing from Israel to Jordan and tweeted, and this is the tweet, "Big news. As of today, the Allenby Bridge is now officially open 24/5. We kept President Joe Biden's promise. This is a win for Palestinians and Israelis alike." And then he added, "Special thanks to Israel's National Security Advisor Tzachi Hanegbi, IDF Coordinator for Government Activities in the Territories, Major General Ayilan, and Israel Airports Authority's Chair, Jerry Gershon, for making all this happen." Commander of the Israeli Air Force, Major General Tomer Bar, warned that reserve pilots who refuse to serve following the judicial reform protests will be sacked. The directive comes amid pressure from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, a source familiar with the pilots says their position has not changed, despite the warning. So this is going to come to a head very soon. A well-known Russian military blogger, Vladimir Tatarsky, was killed in a blast in a cafe in St. Petersburg. The information comes to us from Russian news agencies, quoting sources saying that the blast was caused by an explosive device. Tatarsky, whose real name is Maxim Fomin, had more than 560,000 followers on Telegram. He was one of the most prominent and influential military bloggers who have provided an often critical running commentary on Russia's war in Ukraine. There's a photo of a woman handing Tatarsky a statue, and it's believed that the bomb was in the statue. According to the St. Petersburg website, the explosion took place at a cafe that had one time belonged to Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner private army that is fighting for Russia in Ukraine. RIA news agency said 15 people were injured in the blast. Despite the photo, there was no claim of responsibility. A court in Russia postponed the hearing on the Russian Justice Ministry's request to close down the Jewish Agency office in Moscow. A new date has not been set, but officials in Israel said they were relieved by the court's decision. The Russian government sought to close the local branch of the Jewish agency after they were refused information about Jews who were intending to immigrate to Israel. The Russian ministry also claimed that the Jewish agency was involved in espionage by violating Russian law as they were collecting information and details on the Jewish community and about Jews in Russia. Hackers acting for an ideological group and for reasons affiliated and connected to the Palestinians attacked several Israeli internet sites recently. The hackers perpetrated light attacks. They were not sophisticated hacks. The method and style of the hacks were only, quote, denial of services, unquote, on several Israeli sites. That happens when the hacker overloads the target site with bots and other requests so that it has to crash. So the site crashes. That's not a big deal in the end. Syrian media reported missile strikes near Damascus that targeted Iranian militias that are in Syria. According to the Syrian reports, a military official said that the missile strikes were attributed to Israel and that the attacks were aimed at a site in which Iranian militias were indeed stationed. In the partial victory for Iran, judges at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, ruled that Washington had illegally allowed courts to freeze assets of Iranian companies. The ICJ ordered the United States to pay compensation, the amount of which will be determined later. However, and it's a big however, in a blow to Tehran, the court also said it did not have jurisdiction over $1.75 billion in frozen assets from Iran's central bank, which is by far the largest amount claimed back by Iran. The ruling comes amid heightened tensions between the United States and Iran after tit-for-tat strikes between Iran-backed forces and U.S. personnel in Syria. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Earlier, we laughed at dad jokes. They are funny, they're corny, and the current research shows that laughing with you and at your dad allows children to grow up and mature with a strong and positive parental model. Jewish tradition has a very rich and steeped history of parent-child relationships. Respecting parents is one of the 10 Commandments, as all of you must know or should know. There are many instances where the mitzvah, the commandment to respect and revere parents, is used. Actually, the 10 Commandments are listed twice in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. In one case, the Torah uses the word respect, but in the other case, in the second, it uses revere. The Talmud in Masechet Kedushin, page 31b, the backside of the folio page, records the following, and I'm quoting exactly. Our rabbis taught, what is revere and what is honor? Revere means that the son must neither stand in his father's place nor sit in his father's place, nor contradict his father's words, nor support his words when he is arguing with another sage. Honor means that he must give him food and drink, clothe and cover him, lead him in and out. And the passage just before this, or a little bit before this, on the bottom of page 30a, and then continuing on the top of 30b, in Kedushin reads, our rabbis taught, there are 3 partners in every person, the Holy One, blessed be He, the father and the mother. When a person honors his father and mother, the Holy One, blessed be He, says, I view them as though I had dwelt among them, and they had honored me. For the rabbis, parents are partners with God on creation of their child. The metaphor is extremely powerful. Interestingly and importantly, the commandment to respect parents is extended to teachers and rabbis by the rabbis. Respect and revere for teachers and rabbis is so important because they play the role of parents. In Latin, we would call it in loco parentes. The French commentator Rashi, also known as Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, comments on the verses to respect and revere with a terse synopsis of the Gemara. Do not sit in your father's seat. He's saying seat does not only mean simply the chair, it means their traditional place. In our home, when we were children, we never sat in our parents' seats. And I always stood for my teachers when they walked into a room. And I still too do that to this very day. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again this week on JBS.